controlled burning. It has been happening in Canada in some places, and there are movements towards returning to Indigenous practices of maintaining the land. A lot of research has harmed Indigenous communities, and it's been like the methods of like extracting knowledge. It's been harmful in a lot of instances in Canada, and so this is something that I think needs to be prioritized.
Being an artist can be a heck of a ride, but you're not alone. On Journey of the Art, we tell inspiring stories of artists and chat with those who support us on this path. I'm your host, Lola Opataya, writer, editor, singer, and all-round lover of words. Come with me on the journey. Hi, and welcome once again to Journey of the Art. In today's episode, we're discussing environmental stewardship in the poetry collection Shadow Price. Borrowing its title from a finance term, the estimated price of a good or service for which no market price exists, Shadow Price examines the idea of value in a capitalist world and the multi-generational impacts of the loss of biodiversity. It urges us to reflect on our own participation in climate change and reevaluate the things we value. Shadow Price is scheduled for release on April 1, 2025 from House of Anansi Press. My guest and author of Shadow Price is Farah Ghafoor. Farah is an award-winning poet living on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Her work was awarded the E.J. Pratt Medal and Prize in Poetry, longlisted for the CBC Poetry Prize, is taught in university courses and published in The Walrus, The Fiddlehead, Rome, and elsewhere. Raised in New Brunswick in Southern Ontario, Ghafoor now works in Toronto, also known as Toronto, as an accountant. Welcome, Farah.
Hi, Lola. I'm so happy to be here.
You know, I just realized, because I always ask my guests this before I hit record, I didn't ask you how to pronounce your name, and I hope I didn't butcher it. Did I say
perfect,
it right?
Farah Ghafoor. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Okay. Well, before we continue the conversation, if you don't know, you can find Journey of the Art wherever you get your podcasts. So check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms to listen on the go, follow the show, and leave a comment. This really helps us to boost our visibility so more folks like you can discover us and join the community. Also, as always, I'd love to connect with you on Instagram, so please follow the show at Journey of the Art Pod. All right, Farah, I'm curious about your story. I was just saying how you're an accountant and maybe a poet by night. So how did the stars align to bring you here?
So I stumbled upon poetry by accident when I was in the second grade. I found it in a workbook that my parents would bring home every summer so we could get ahead. And throughout middle school and high school, I was simultaneously interested in I guess making things. I was interested in startup culture and coding. That never went anywhere. But I was interested in the mechanics, I guess the mechanics of the world and how these apps or these creative projects came to be. So when I was in high school, when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do for, the rest of my life, I was already working very hard at poetry. I was very passionate. I was entering contests. I was submitting to literary journals, and I was just at work trying to develop my craft. And while I loved poetry, I never wanted external pressure for my work. I wanted to keep it fun, and I didn't really like being told what to do. In high school, I took a course, a creative writing course, and I hated completing the assignments every week, even though I knew it would benefit me, I'm sure, but it took the fun out of it. And so I was still interested in business, at the time. And so that's why I decided to pursue accounting.
Yeah.
And that is why I never studied creative writing. And yeah, I think the external pressure, like the thing is, I put so much pressure on myself in everything
Right.
I do. I didn't want any additional pressure from the courses or
Right.
from like any authority figure to have an impact on what I love most.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very interesting perspective. I love the fact that you decided this is how much influence I want on my art, but also be the honesty to be able to say, I want to go study something else, right? And explore a different part of me. And so I'm curious, do you love the two things? Do you enjoy accounting? And do you, obviously you love poetry, but do you enjoy accounting?
I don't think anybody likes accounting. I think we all just tolerate accounting. I think what
Right.
I was really fascinated by was economics, and maybe I should
Mm,
have studied economics because I think I enjoyed those courses the most during undergrad. I was interested in, I guess, how the market impacts what we interact with in our daily lives,
mm,
like healthcare, like the legal system. And so I found those courses to be the most interesting during my undergrad.
mm.
And eventually that did have an impact on my work.
Right, right. That you're right. It does have an impact on your work. And so we're gonna get to the business of the day and talk about your upcoming work, Shadow Price, and upcoming at the time of this recording. But Shadow Price, as I was saying earlier, forces us to think about our stewardship of the earth and our own implicit or explicit participation in environmental negligence. So let's begin with the poem The Dream Eaters. There's such a violence used to describe the way humans interact with the earth and its resources. The speaker describes the excavating of rivers for sand, the hacking of glaciers for cocktail cubes, and the lining of dead birds as if by firing squad. And to sum it all up, the speaker says our violence could rival that foreign sun. What would you say inspires this sort of interaction with the earth? I know that's a lot to take in.
Do you mean like our collective interaction with the
Yes,
earth?
our collective
Yes.
interaction. Yes.
I suppose in most cultures actually we value the earth and its wonders as resources.
Mm,
And so when you do that, you form a sort of distance from the earth and everything that it gives us, whether it's produce, whether it's beauty,
mm,
whether it's the sea and the sand.
mhm.
As long as we see it as n- not connected to our lives, to it's much easier to enact such violence, such
Right,
enormous violence toward the earth.
right, right. And I'm curious, what would you, what do you think causes that disconnect? Right, like yes, we feel that disconnection, and so we treat the earth, in a different way than we should. But we also know the science of photosynthesis, and we know the science of oxygen and carbohydrates, and how we need the plants to live, and the plants need us. Like we are there's a codependency, right? What do you think causes that disconnect?
I think it might be how I live in a city.
Hmm.
So I think it might be just the structure and like the architecture
Hmm.
of our cities and our towns,
Right.
because when so many people like live together in such a small amount of space, there is not a lot of room
Yeah.
for parks, for any green areas.
Right.
And we sort of we're we're almost encouraged to lose interest
Hmm.
in things that do not won't make us money,
Hmm.
that won't benefit us in material ways.
Right.
And as long as as long as we allow that disconnect to impact us, and as long as we do not go and search
Right.
for instances or or locations where we can be connected with nature, it's this disconnect. It's going to persist,
Yeah.
because as what we learn in classrooms is kept in classrooms,
Mm.
and as long as it's not a productive activity
Yeah.
to go and not improve, but um, feel at home
Mm.
in nature, that disconnection is going to persist, I think.
Yeah, I really love what you said about, so long as it doesn't translate to how does this make me money? There's no sense of grounding. Like this, I need this thing needs me. So I really like that. Let's move on to the poem, The Plot. And I think we get to unpack this idea of capitalism and, you know, does it equate to money in this poem. It's the longest, I would say, the longest poem in the collection. And in the poem, the speaker talks about the effects of capitalism and colonialism on forestation and the concept of logocentrism. The speaker says logocentrism is the Western value of preferring the written or spoken word over the thing which is being referenced, and a thing that often happens in the process of translation. So, is this replacing of intent, where the more powerful can twist the meaning to suit their interest and disadvantage the less powerful? And the speaker also infers that this could have happened in Bangalore, where land was leased for 999 years, which is ridiculous. But can you share more on this?
Yeah, so when I began the plot, I
Mm-hmm.
was interested in figuring out how and why the climate crisis came to be, because I
Mm.
knew that so much of um, our intent to extract resources from the earth, a lot of it happened in the last century,
Yeah.
and that was through colonialism. And so, a major aspect of how we talk about that today is um, it's determined by who has the power in this conversation, who
Mm.
can direct this kind of conversation.
Mm.
And a large part of that is translation,
Right.
because so much research, so much of our literature, even, it's focused on the Western canon and Western perspectives.
Right.
And the West colonized the
Right.
East, and British India.
Mm-hmm.
So it was important for me to talk about that kind of the power of how we speak about extravagism,
Mm.
and how translation directly impacts how we treat those countries today,
Yeah.
and how we see them as collaborators in the climate crisis.
Right. I mean, this is something that I can relate to because I come from a country that was colonized as well, and you'll hear stories of how our forefathers traded people for things like mirrors and silly things really. And when it came to this part about language and how language can be twisted to mean something to the advantage of one and the disadvantage of the other, a part of me was wondering if that also happened in that time, right? Like language is supposed to be the thing that through which we communicate, but it can also be the tool of oppression, and I that really stood out to me, and I wanted to point that out. And also, thank you for showing that there's a story there where the land was leased for 999 years, and then it got bumped down to 99 years, and then something else happened after that. But it's very interesting what we can find when we look back in history and see how language, which should have been the tool for advancement, now serves as a tool of oppression. So, still on the plot, the speaker touches on something crucial, and it is the controlled burning of the land. a traditional indigenous practice that prevents wildfires by diffusing seeds and ingesting the saplings and underbrush. The speaker notes that this is indigenous knowledge that's been preserved over the years. And as I read this, I wondered if perhaps one of the reasons why we're not stewarding the earth well is because we're missing generational wisdom. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's absolutely true. I think that even if we look at the LA fires that happened recently,
Mm,
the a big reason why like the land was not able to sustain itself or protect itself against
mhm,
fire is because of mismanagement.
mm,
And a lot of that knowledge, at least in Canada, has been lost because
yeah,
of the systematic mistreatment of Indigenous peoples.
yeah,
So, controlled burning. It has been happening in Canada in some places, and there are movements towards returning um, to Indigenous practices of maintaining the land, because a lot of the a lot of the practices have been undervalued, and they've been
mm,
systemically destroyed.
mm,
And I think it's so important to return to those practices, because
yeah,
if it's not, a lot of the research that's come about,
mhm,
um, we tend to value science-based practices.
mhm,
However, a lot of research has harmed Indigenous communities, and
yeah,
it's like the methods of like extracting knowledge. It's been harmful in a lot of
yeah,
instances in Canada, and so this is something that I think needs to be prioritized.
mm,
However, like in a very safe and Indigenous led um, types of initiatives.
yeah, yeah. I love what you said about the science because at the beginning of the collection, there's a line in there about how the science of this is convoluted and anyone can, basically have their own narration. So the science is wonky, and so what are we really basing our practices on if everything doesn't stand on firm ground? So I really like that you shared that. So let's talk about a childhood game involving the skinning of trees. And this is also in the poem, The Plot. I think there's so much to unpack in that poem. So I keep going back to that specific one because there are layers of meaning in there. And in this game, the children exchange these skins, that's the bark of the trees, for material gain. And the speaker wonders about the satisfaction that's derived from this game. And I think this is such a poignant scene where the reader sees this participation in environmental negligence across generations. So, from old to young, we're all making choices that aren't the best for the planet. Is this something you were conscious of, this multi generational contribution to climate change?
Absolutely. So I only remembered that this was a game that I played. I was the
Oh,
speaker
okay.
here. So
I wasn't
I
sure if it was part memoir or if it was all like just yeah, but that's a good good one
yes.
to know.
And so I remember that recently while I was writing this poem,
Mm,
and I thought that it was so strange that nobody had stopped us from
mm,
peeling the bark off of trees, because I knew we talked about it and teachers heard, but I think that kind of treatment towards the environment, the
mm,
fact that children do that and did that and probably still do that,
mm,
it was concerning that that was our attitude from the very beginning. And
right.
so when we don't teach our children to value the environment
Mm,
and to protect it, I think that it's going to be their fate to continue unless
right.
they educate themselves. And I think we are moving toward that kind of protection of
Mm,
natural like non-human living creatures. But I think that it takes a lot of like an internal motivation to continue to be very aware of how you treat ants, of how you treat the air by polluting it, and the ocean and the trees around us. And so this is something that this is a scene that I wanted to put into the book because I wanted to demonstrate how even at that early age, like in the 2000s, there was this movement towards slowing down the climate crisis, at least. But the fact that children weren't being taught this as well as we all should have. It was concerning to think about.
Yeah, and that stood out to me because I remember as a kid, one of the things that we used to do was we would like slap plants and trees and cut off the leaves, and it was fun for us. We did that as kids, and as I was reading that, I was like, yeah, why did no one tell us that was not the right thing to do? The only time anyone stopped us was if we were beating down a tomato plant, because obviously, I'm gonna benefit something from this plant. And that goes back to that point you made earlier about the disconnect between this is useful for me and or I need this or this needs me, right? And nobody stopped us. Nobody said, don't do that. The only thing they said was, you're littering the ground. Nobody said, you're hurting the trees. You're not preserving that ecosystem. So I wanted to pull that out because that stood out to me. And goes back to what you were saying about the culture of care that we learn as kids and how we carry that into our adulthood. So maybe people who are not as conscious of the environment as kids. Actually, I'm almost sure that it would not be a maybe, but almost a certainty that if you were not conscious of it as a kid, you are likely to not be conscious of it as an adult. And it will take a lot of work to get you to that place where you're being a good steward of the earth. So thank you for sharing that. So let's talk about structure now. I find the structures of some of the poems intriguing. And it's like a merge of poetry and essay to help the reader see and think. So those two forms have dual purposes. How did this idea come to you, and how easy or difficult was it to implement the structure?
So for my own work, the tone and the content dictate the structure. So for some of the poems, they are more image-based and they rely on the reader's attention to sort of slow down and take pauses as necessary to absorb what the poem is saying. And so an example of that is The Dream Eaters.
Yeah.
Whereas in the plot, I wanted it to function as sort of a sort of a story. And an easier way to digest stories and essays and that kind of informational content is through proper sentence structure. And another place where you'll see a lot of prose poems is where I want the tone to be colloquial. So a conversational sort of tone. And for me, when I want to explain larger concepts, I lean towards regular sentence structure and prose like forms, because I want my focus and my priority is having the reader understand the content, because I think that poetry is the perfect tool for understanding. The use of the metaphor and the simile is to help somebody understand something. If you say, if you've never seen an apple before, I would say, oh, it's sweet and citrusy like an orange, or it's red as a hot coal, and then you understand what I'm saying.
Right.
And so, and large intention of mine for this book was to help people understand things that seem like big, big complex topics. I wanted
Right.
to break it down
Right.
through these forms.
Right. Right. And how easy or difficult was it to implement that structure?
For me, it's not difficult because okay, the plot was a little bit difficult. It took a lot of time. I would say like on a line by line level, it wasn't
Yeah.
difficult, but sort of getting all that research in
Yeah.
was difficult because I had never written such a long, like heavy, like research focused poem before. And to focus and to allow the reader to be like taken slowly through each topic and have them understand piece by piece what's going on. That did take me a while. It took me at least a few weekends to implement. And so I hope it's easy to understand now because I worked so hard on it.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping the tone as well is very more like more straightforward than an image-based poem.
Yeah. Yeah. And and as I was reading it, I was like, oh, there's the accountant part of you. Like it's analytical, but it's also creative. So it's that that dual purpose that I was talking about earlier. You can see with the imagery, but you also get to think, with the plot. So I thought that was so cool, and I said I have to ask her about this. So in one of your Substack articles, because I was looking you up, you talk about doubting your ability to do the subject matter justice and hesitating to take on the project because you felt you needed to know more. How were you able to overcome this, and what made you finally feel ready to start the project? First of all, do you remember that article?
Yes. It's
Okay.
my most recent one, I think.
Yeah.
What made me finally take it on is my deadline for the editing of the book.
That's a good motivation.
Yes. I did put it off until like the very end. I only had a few weeks left before my deadline. But the whole time I was writing the book, I knew that I felt like I knew it was missing a large consideration of colonialism and how it's impacted the climate crisis.
Yeah.
And so it was hard to get into, but I just went to a cafe and I was like, I'm going to stay here all day. And then I stayed there for 12 hours and I was doing so much research on, I started out with research on trees because I felt like that's where I wanted to start. I was interested in trees and and how they communicate with each other. But I took out so many books too, but it all ended up being useless because of the research that so many books are based off of, that they communicate solely through fungal networks. Newer research has it's basically proved that that's not totally true. And so I did that 12 hours of research, and then it ended up not even being in the book. It ended up being in the first line saying that the science is convoluted. But that was disheartening. But the next day I went again to the same cafe the same weekend, and I kept digging because I had specific goals for the poem. I wanted to reach into the history of British India and see how trees were impacted during this time and where the focus was, because a lot of my anxiety about this poem and about like not knowing exactly what I was going to talk about, it came from not knowing the material. But you really have to just take out all these books and like force yourself to sit down, because that anxiety is not going anywhere. It will only be extinguished by doing the work.
Right. I mean, I'm grateful that you took the time to do the work because I learned a lot just reading. And I keep talking about the plot because I really love the poem, but I learned a lot, and I think that if your goal was to help people understand, I certainly understood. So it worked.
Fantastic. I've done my job. I can sleep. I can
You
sleep
can
soundly.
sleep. Okay, so far as we round up, I thought I'd ask, how would you like your readers to approach this work? Because as I was saying to you earlier, this is a topic that isn't very well understood and people have different opinions on it. So, how would you like for people to approach your work?
I would like them to approach it with an open mind and an open mind, and especially in regards to learning something new about the world. If
Mm,
not, um, yes, I think learning something new about the
mm,
world, because everything I wrote in the book, it's based in facts and research. So I think this internal barrier that people have
yeah.
when it comes to reading different opinions about how we treat the world, treat the earth, and how our own decisions have consequences. I think that many people still do not have that openness and that urge to seek
Mm,
knowledge,
mm,
even if it even if the knowledge says that they're not doing something
right,
that will benefit future generations.
right,
I think that as long as people do approach it with an open mind, they'll take something away from it.
right,
If not everything I want to communicate.
right, right. And I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up this conversation. And I should also say that I really appreciate the notes at the back of the poem. Like you have all these notes with the actual research that was consulted to be able to write this. So that you don't just write us a poem, but you also leave us some resources. And I think that's a great opportunity for people to check out more information, to enlighten themselves and make the changes that they should make. But I really want to thank you for coming on the show, Farah. Thank you
Thank you
for
so
having
much.
this conversation with me. I will leave links to your work in the description or show notes for anyone who wants to get it. Shadow Price is out on April 1, 2025. Thank you, Farah.
Thank you, Lola. I've had an amazing time.
I'm glad. On the next episode, I'll be chatting with another inspiring artist. But before then, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me what you think about this show and this episode. Feel free to drop me a note here or send me a DM on Instagram at Journey of the Art Plot. Finally, please subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, or follow and rate the show if you're listening elsewhere. Help me connect with other artists who need a dose of inspiration today. Until next time, stay on the journey of your art.